Welcome back for another session of Drive Time. Hundreds of you, hundreds, have voted and said you enjoy these extra segments, these Drive Time segments where you can listen at work or listen while you're commuting or whatever. Basically, I am talking to you while you're doing something, hopefully, that's important, enlightening, or rewarding in some fashion. But first up, we've got a weather alert on the nines, snow alert. Blizzard conditions are on the way to the tri-state area. A non-contiguous weather front as the three states are Idaho, Alabama, and Hawaii. Dress the kids properly for school and don't forget to steer into the skid. Also, look out for delays in the northbound approach to the I-10 bridge. A tour bus full of circus clowns is overturned on the on-ramp. It's going to be hours before they have them all out of there. So anyway, let's move on for the topic that I have chosen for this one, and it's DOGE. You've heard of the Department of Government Efficiency. It's all over the news. I don't know how you feel about it. Personally, I love the fact that they are looking into government waste. None of us like to pay taxes, and I think what we hate even more is when they throw away our taxes on nonsense, like comic books promoting transgender issues in Peru, transgender mice, racial equality in Ghana. I mean, and these things, we've all known that there's been government waste for years, and it gets reported and we all get outraged about it, but nobody ever really does anything about it. The politicians promise they're going to shrink the government, look into waste, fraud, and corruption, but that's never seems to happen because the politicians making the decisions about this are getting a lot of kickbacks from these taxpayer funds being sent out in the form of government grants, contracts, and government loans to businesses that will ultimately go bankrupt while their owners lie on a beach in Bimini outside their $14 million beachfront property. And this stuff happens all the time. We're hearing about contracts, government contracts that were supposed to last 6 months that are still being paid on 30 years later. It's quite astounding. I mean, I have heard reports that there are $7.1 trillion in funds in the last decade that are unaccounted for. We literally have no idea how that money was spent because it wasn't required of the people appropriating it and sending out the checks. It wasn't required that they fill in where the money was going. Now, you and I, we do our bills and we fill out a little checkbook how much money, the date we wrote the check, the number on the check, and where it's going. Apparently, the people in government who have trillions of dollars to spend, they don't have to do any of that. And as I said, I don't care where you fall politically. That's just wrong. And I don't care who's doing it, Republicans, Independents, or Democrats. It's wrong. It's got to stop. And obviously, Republicans are dipping into the till as well because they've had majorities in the past where they've held, all three houses of the government, executive and congressional, the Senate and the House, and they've done nothing to stop this waste. In fact, they encourage it. Remember earmarks? Remember pork barrel spending? Well, it's still here. And you can even go to college and get a degree in applying for government grants. And as we know, these government grants can go for anything. Art projects, you can get a government grant to write a novel. You can get a government grant to travel. You apply and you know how to fill it out right. And there are people who will help you. There are places you can go and pay them a fee, and they'll do all the paperwork for you for a percentage of the cash that you've stolen from the government. Now I don't do political things. I don't do political whatever blogs or entries, but I want to tell you about something personal that happened to me involving this kind of stuff. So back in the 1980s, I was just starting out in comics. and I was able to quit my day job as a security guard, and I was living in one room um, on my a horse ranch not a horse ranch, but a horse farm that belonged to my sister. And she had this really nice piece of property in rural property in Pennsylvania, and she had a barn and stable, and of course a house to live in. Horse people don't care about houses. If you know any horse people, you know what I'm talking about. They don't care about the house; they care about the stable. And my dad had also lived there for a while, and but he moved off to Florida, and he left behind a workshop, and the workshop had a bathroom. So I moved in my dad's old workshop. I got a, I moved in a sofa to sleep on, and all my comic books and everything else. I moved in there. It was, I guess you could look back and say it was a rough time for me, but I was still an independent dude, and I was single again, if you know what I mean. And so this is the beginning of my career. I got a desk with a word processor on it, and all my comics, all my crap, all my books, and a sofa. And that's all I got. I was working as a security guard. It was the only job I could get. My sister recommended me. She was working at this insurance company, and she said they're always looking for security guards. So I applied. I got it. I think because I'm 6'3". I'm security guard material, so, if nothing else. So I'm I was able to leave that job because I got enough comic book work to justify. It looked like I had a full-time employment in comics for the time being. Freelancers always worry that the work's going to run out someday. But at least for the foreseeable future, for the next year, I was promised enough comic book work to pay the bills. And of course, at the time, I had no bills. I had no insurance. My sister was not charging me to stay there. I just had to pay the electric. And she had a well, so there was no water bill. Anyway, I'm living the bachelor life for a bit there. And I'm just getting started. And I had met someone, a comic book creator that you all know. You would know the name, but I'm not going to say the name because the story's rather embarrassing for him. But this comic book creator who I met approached me with the idea of doing an anti-drug comic book, a drug to tell the kids to just say no. And you remember Nancy Reagan, and Reagan was still in office at this time. So I said, well, where's this? What are you doing this for? Where's this money coming from? And he says, well, I met someone who got a government grant to do an anti-drug comic book, for the kids, for the kids. And he got this government grant, and he turned to this comic book creator who I shall not name and said, would you be interested in producing it? And I said, well, that's a worthy cause. And he said, would you want to write it? I said, yeah. I'll write it for free. It was supposed to be like a 20-page comic, and it's going to be distributed to schools, wherever there were kids. And I said, what's the budget for art? I mean, who's going to draw this thing? Now, this comic book creator was very adamant that he wasn't going to draw it. I said, what's the budget on this thing? And he said, $1,500. I said, $1,500? $1,500? And he goes, yeah. I said, this guy got a government grant? And he goes, yeah, that's where he got the money. I said, this guy got a government grant for $1,500. And he goes, yeah. And I said, that's not possible. Nobody gets a government grant for like under 50K. I mean, you could get a government grant for 50K to make an independent film project. So I said, there's no way in the world this is all the money that guy got. I said, this guy got probably 100K or more, and gave them a song and dance. And he's going to keep most of it, and he's going to give you $1,500 to produce a 20-page comic book, which even at 80s page rates was freaking impossible to do quality work for $1,500. And I said, I don't want to work on this thing. I mean, I said I would write it for free, but I'm not going to write it if it's going to turn out looking like crap. I said, what's the point? It doesn't serve the purpose. If we make this really crappy comic book and give it to the kids, it's going to have zero impact on them. And I said, no, I don't want to be a part of this. I said, you got to get a hold of this guy and find out how much he got. I said, you've got to squeeze more out of this guy's government grant. And I said, I understand he's got to do printing and all the rest of it, but printing really, when you get down to it on a 20-page comic, is not your biggest expense. Your biggest expense is the talent. And I said, this guy's got to pony up at least 10K, or there's no point in even doing this. We won't be able to hire anyone talented enough to make this look good. So we left it there for a little while. And then he calls me back a few weeks later and says, so are you going to write this anti-drug comic? And I said, did you find out how much the guy got? And he goes, no, I didn't ask him. I said, why didn't you ask him? And he goes, well, it's like none of my business. I said, it is your business. It's your business. It's my business. If we're going to produce this comic book, we need to know how much cash this guy got. I said, this sounds like a dodge. This sounds like a scam. And I said, I really don't want to be part of it. And I said, call me back when you've got 10K to spend on art. And once again, I stress, I was going to write it for free. I had no problem with that. Even though it was government money and a government program, which I hate all of that stuff, I thought, well, if this turns a couple of kids around, I'll write it. It would be an interesting and challenging assignment. Well, he gets mad at me and he says, well, you don't care about drug addicts. I said, what? And he goes, yeah, drugs have never touched your life. And I said, first of all, you don't know that. You don't know that. And in fact, my oldest sister died of a drug overdose. She was a long time addict to methamphetamines, heroin, basically whatever came down the pike. And I had seen in my own life how drugs change a person. Maybe you've experienced this too. I mean, drugs just don't hurt the person taking them. They hurt everyone that loves that person. And my oldest sister was completely and utterly changed by drug use. She was the sweetest, kindest, most generous person you would ever want to meet. Everybody loved my oldest sister. She was personality plus. And she was terrific to me. She was, I had two older sisters, and she was always my favorite because she spoiled the hell out of me. She would make me special meals to eat when our parents were away, and she would, read to me and all this other stuff. And we were like pals, even though there was like 9 years difference between us. And just the most wonderful person. And somewhere along the line, after she, got married and left the house, she got involved in drugs. She got into the drug world. And I mean, deep into the drug world. I mean, junkie town. I mean, really, really bad. And it completely altered her personality. She became manipulative. She still had that sweet demeanor, which she turned into her mutant ability to manipulate people. And she manipulated my parents. She manipulated everyone around her. And she ended up with a really, really bad crowd. I mean, I would not have her to my house. I mean, I loved my sister, but I wouldn't have her to my house because I didn't know who she was going to bring along with her. And I quite honestly didn't want her to know where I lived because, if you know anybody who's addicted to drugs or whatever, all they're thinking about is getting money for that next hit. And if it wasn't her, it would be one of her quote unquote friends, home invasion or whatever. So I associated with her at family events, but I never had her to my house or anything, which, I guess I should have felt bad about, but I didn't feel bad about it because I was protecting my family from my own sister. And this is the kind of impact that the drugs had. And so this guy saying, you don't know anything about drugs, like I live some sort of Leave It to Beaver life. I came from a rough neighborhood. And we had these problems with my oldest sister. And my dad was, had a problem with alcohol for a while. So it's like, I know a whole lot more about addiction than you do. I said, that's why I said I would write this book for free. And then he adds insult to injury. He says, well, you'd rather write a Spider-Man book than write this. And I'm like, hey, if you can get enough money that we can do a Spider-Man anti-drug comic with one of the Marvel artists, I will still write it for free. I will still write. No, I don't want to write Spider-Man more than I want to write this. In fact, I would really like to write this, but I don't want it coming out like a piece of crap. And this guy could not, it was like I was talking to somebody from another planet. He could not understand. And ultimately, he still wanted to do it. So he went ahead and he found some, fanboy wannabes at a convention. And they said they would draw it. Well, these guys were not ready for prime time. So anyway, he ends up writing it. They end up drawing it. And even at the rock bottom wannabe, desperate to get in the comic book business prices these guys were charging, they still couldn't afford color. These guys they would not color the comic in for the amount of money that he was paying, which was like just rock bottom page rates. You'd have to be absolutely, insane to get into the comic book business, thinking this was going to be your big break. And the project they did, it just looked like the worst comic imaginable. It looked like it was done by children who weren't particularly gifted. And I don't know whatever happened to it. It probably never got printed because that wasn't the point, was it? The point of it was that this clown got his government grant to do whatever he wanted to do. Buy a hot car, pay himself a big, huge salary as a nonprofit. And this is something we see it's endemic in our whole society and in our whole economy, is that we have this like secret underground shadow economy of nonprofits and non-government organizations. The non-government organization is a ridiculous term because they get all their money from the government. They get all their money from you and me paying taxes. And in a lot of cases, these NGOs and these nonprofits actively break the law. There are, organizations that proclaim to be Christian organizations that get taxpayer money to help illegal aliens sneak into the country. I mean, we are paying these people to break the law, and there's more and more and more. I mean, you can look this stuff up, and this is all the stuff that DOGE is going after. In addition to inefficiency, the inefficiency in government is shocking, absolutely shocking. The level of stupidity and greed and avarice, although I repeat myself, within the government. And that's why, my first reflex was, no, I don't want to work on this unless there's some reason. I mean, I was thinking if we did this project, this anti-drug comic, and hey, if you can put together a decent roster of talent and everything else, I'll do an anti-drug comic for you anytime. I'll write it free. But if we could have put together a quality product, I would have asked for, hey, can I have 2,000 copies of this? And I would have gone and talked at schools. I talked at schools all the time about comics. And I said, I'll go out on my own. I'll talk to elementary school, junior high, high school students. It was no problem for me in my local area to set up, an assembly. Remember assemblies in school? Set up an assembly. I'll speak in the auditorium. I'll speak in the cafeteria, wherever you got, and we can hand out free copies of these things. And I was willing to do all of that, but not if it was going to be an unworthy project, because that didn't suit anybody. So there you have it. That was my experience with government corruption firsthand. And luckily, I was a suspicious far right-wing extremist or libertarian, and I knew, man, this stinks to high heaven. Somebody's getting rich off of this. And I hope he crashed his Mercedes or whatever it was he bought with the government grant and died in a fiery wreck. But that was pretty much the end of any kind of relationship or friendship I had with that unnamed comic book creator. And I kind of, moved on to bigger and better things. So there you go. There you have it. My little tale of running into the targets of DOGE. So thanks for listening. If you watch this, there wasn't much to see, but thanks for watching. Thanks for liking and subscribing and everything else. And I will, this is fun. I'll be doing more of these down the road as I think of topics to talk about in a reasonably intelligent way. All right, remember, They're still unloading those clowns. So use the detour.